The tension didn't explode all at once. It tightened gradually, almost politely at first, the way authority often does when it believes compliance is inevitable. The initial notice arrived without drama. A formal envelope, neutral language, a reference to community standards and exterior display regulations. It stated that the American flag mounted on the front of the house violated HOA guidelines due to size, placement, and visual inconsistency. The tone wasn't aggressive, but it carried an assumption that the matter was already settled, that removal was a given, that resistance wouldn't even be considered. At first, it felt surreal. The flag had been there for years. It wasn't oversized or damaged. It wasn't obstructing anything. It wasn't new. Nothing about the neighborhood had changed. The only thing that had shifted was attention. A new board member. A revised interpretation of an old rule. A sudden desire to assert relevance through enforcement. The homeowner responded not with defiance, but with caution. Documentation was reviewed. Federal and state protections regarding flag displays were quietly researched. HOA bylaws were reread line by line. The language was vague enough to be flexible, and that flexibility clearly favored whoever enforced it. What stood out wasn't what the rules said, but how selectively they had been applied. Other homes displayed flags. Smaller ones. Seasonal ones. Some mounted temporarily, others semi-permanently. None of them had received notices. None of them were being cited. The difference wasn't the flag. It was the target. The follow-up notice arrived faster than expected. This one referenced non-compliance. It included a deadline and a fine schedule. The amounts were small but deliberate, increasing incrementally with each passing day. It wasn't about the money. It was about pressure, a steady reminder that authority was watching, counting, and waiting for submission. The flag remained. What followed was escalation disguised as procedure. The HOA began conducting visual inspections of the property. Photos were taken from a street. Notes were added to internal records. The flag was documented repeatedly, as if repetition might transform legality into violation. Each new report cited the same issue, using slightly different wording, reinforcing the illusion of legitimacy through volume. Emails arrived next, carefully worded, firm but restrained. They referenced board votes, compliance committees, and the HOA's responsibility to maintain harmony within the community. The flag was framed as disruptive, not because of what it was, but because of what it represented. The implication was subtle but unmistakable. Visibility itself was the problem. Neighbors began behaving differently. Some avoided eye contact. Others lingered near the property longer than usual. A few asked questions that sounded rehearsed, framed as concern, but clearly fishing for reaction. Word had spread. The flag wasn't just a rule violation anymore. It was a topic, a symbol, a test case. Then came the formal hearing notice. The homeowner was invited, summoned, really, to attend a compliance review meeting. The purpose was to resolve the ongoing issue. The language suggested fairness, but the outcome felt predetermined. The board had already documented noncompliance. The fines were already accruing. The meeting wasn't about discussion. It was about validation. Preparation shifted from casual research to deliberate strategy. Every notice was organized. Every bylaw reference was cross-checked. Federal statutes protecting the display of the American flag were printed and highlighted. Previous enforcement actions, or lack thereof, were documented through publicly visible evidence. Patterns were emerging, and those patterns told a story the HOA likely hadn't intended to tell. The meeting itself was procedural and cold. The board sat elevated physically and symbolically. The flag was discussed not as an object, but as an issue, as something to be managed, as a deviation. The homeowner's position was acknowledged politely and then dismissed through repetition of the same rules, the same interpretations, the same insistence that compliance was the only acceptable outcome. No resolution was offered, only consequences. Within days, the fines increased. Notices became weekly. The tone hardened. Words like mandatory, enforcement, and penalty appeared more frequently. The HOA wasn't backing down. It was doubling down, confident that persistence would win where reason hadn't. Then came the threat of further action. The HOA warned that continued noncompliance could result in liens, legal fees, and additional sanctions. The language escalated quickly, skipping intermediate steps. It was meant to intimidate, to create urgency, to force a decision under pressure. The flag was no longer just a decoration. It had become a liability. At least, that was the narrative being pushed. What made the situation infuriating wasn't just the overreach. It was the hypocrisy. Other violations went unaddressed. Fences out of compliance. Unapproved paint colors. Structures added without permission. Those issues lingered unresolved for months, sometimes years. But the flag, visible, symbolic, impossible to ignore, was treated as an emergency. The disparity was impossible to miss. The homeowner filed a formal request for clarification, citing federal protections and asking the HOA to justify its position in writing. The response was delayed, then evasive. It avoided direct engagement with the legal references, instead reiterating the HOA's authority to regulate aesthetics. It was clear the board was hoping to outlast resistance, not confront it. The next move crossed the line. The HOA issued a notice stating that if the flag was not removed by a specific date, they would take corrective action. The phrase was intentionally vague. It suggested intervention without explicitly stating what that intervention would be. The ambiguity was meant to unsettle, to force compliance through fear of the unknown. At that point, the conflict shifted from irritating to alarming. The homeowner consulted legal resources more seriously. What had initially seemed like a nuisance now showed signs of constitutional implications. The HOA wasn't just enforcing a rule. It was attempting to suppress a protected form of expression through financial and procedural pressure. The distinction mattered, and it carried consequences the HOA didn't appear to be considering. Meanwhile, the fines continued to accumulate. Each notice felt less like communication and more like documentation, evidence of a pattern forming in real time. The HOA was creating a record, but not the one it thought it was. Every escalation added weight. Every threat added context. The situation was no longer about whether the flag complied. It was about how far authority was willing to go to assert control. The tension became public. Neighbors began choosing sides, quietly at first. Some expressed support in private, unwilling to challenge the HOA openly. Others repeated board talking points, framing the issue as rules being rules. The community fractured along lines of compliance versus principle, and the HOA found itself at the center of a debate it had no interest in moderating. Then, without warning, the HOA sent a final notice. It declared the homeowner in willful violation. It outlined potential legal remedies. It referenced outside counsel. It framed the situation as adversarial, no longer procedural. The flag, once a point of pride, was now the centerpiece of an institutional challenge. The homeowner had a choice: remove the flag and let the issue quietly disappear, or push back and force the HOA to defend its actions under scrutiny it could no longer control. The decision wasn't made impulsively. It was the result of months of pressure, documentation, and realization. Compliance would end the conflict, but it would also validate the overreach. Resistance would escalate it, but it would also expose it. The flag stayed. What the HOA didn't realize was that by escalating so aggressively, it had shifted the battlefield. This was no longer a neighborhood dispute. It was a question of rights, authority, and accountability. And the next move wouldn't come from a compliance committee or a fine schedule. It would come from outside the HOA entirely. As the deadline passed and the penalties triggered, the stage was set for a confrontation far bigger than anyone in that boardroom had anticipated. And when the response arrived, it would force the HOA to answer not just to a homeowner, but to principles they had assumed would never be tested. The moment of reckoning didn't arrive with shouting or spectacle. It arrived with weight. By the time the HOA scheduled what they labeled a final compliance review, the conflict had already outgrown the neighborhood that spawned it. The flag still hung in place. The fines had accumulated into a number meant to intimidate rather than collect. The threat of corrective action loomed, undefined but unmistakable. Everything about the situation suggested that the HOA expected surrender or at least quiet retreat. What they did not expect was how fully their own actions had been documented, preserved, and reframed. The meeting was conducted as though the outcome were predetermined. The board reviewed its own timeline, its notices, its votes. The flag was again described as a violation, stripped of symbolism and reduced to an object out of compliance. Authority was cited repeatedly, almost reflexively. The language was procedural, confident, and detached, as if repetition itself could substitute for legitimacy. What shifted the atmosphere wasn't confrontation. It was context. The homeowner's response did not challenge the HOA's tone. It challenged its foundation. The escalation was reframed not as enforcement, but as suppression. The notices were no longer isolated actions. They were presented as a sequence. The fines were no longer penalties. They were pressure. The vague threats were no longer administrative language. They were intimidation. What the HOA had treated as routine was now unmistakably systematic. Then came the legal weight the HOA had assumed would never enter the room. The federal protections governing the display of the American flag were not merely referenced. They were applied. Not hypothetically, not defensively. They were positioned directly against the HOA's actions, exposing the gap between assumed authority and actual limitation. The distinction between aesthetic regulation and protected expression became unavoidable. The HOA had not just misinterpreted its bylaws. It had overstepped into territory it had no right to occupy. The realization spread unevenly. Some board members shifted uncomfortably. suddenly aware that repetition could not erase contradiction. Others doubled down internally, clinging to procedure as a shield. But procedure offered no refuge when stacked against law. The structure that had once felt rigid and absolute now felt brittle. The most damaging revelation followed quickly. The HOA's selective enforcement was laid bare, not through accusation, but through comparison. Documented inconsistencies, unaddressed violations, similar displays left untouched. The pattern was undeniable. This wasn't about maintaining harmony. It was about targeting visibility. The flag had not violated standards. It had challenged control. What made the moment irreversible was the shift in audience. This was no longer an internal HOA matter. External scrutiny had arrived, and it did not operate on assumptions. The involvement of civil liberties advocates reframed the conflict entirely. What the HOA believed was a private dispute was now a public question of rights. The board's authority, once exercised behind closed doors, was now exposed to evaluation it could not influence. The confidence that had fueled months of escalation collapsed under that exposure. The HOA's actions were no longer hypothetical risks. They were documented liabilities. Each fine, each notice, each threat became part of a record that told a story the HOA could not revise. The language they had used so casually now read differently under scrutiny. Words like mandatory and corrective action took on implications they could not walk back. The turning point wasn't dramatic. It was absolute. The HOA was informed, formally, unambiguously, that continued enforcement would not just fail, but escalate consequences for the association itself. Legal exposure was no longer a distant possibility. It was immediate, real, expensive. The balance of power shifted not through aggression, but through inevitability. What followed was silence where certainty had once lived. The board recessed, not to deliberate, but to contain. The structure that had relied on momentum suddenly had none. Every possible next step carried risk. Enforcement invited litigation. Retraction invited scrutiny. Doing nothing invited questions. The HOA, so accustomed to dictating outcomes, found itself paralyzed by them. The flag remained untouched. When the meeting reconvened, the shift was unmistakable. The language softened. The urgency evaporated. References to compliance were replaced with vague acknowledgments of review. Deadlines dissolved. Fines were no longer emphasized. What had once been framed as an inevitability was now presented as a misunderstanding. The public humiliation wasn't theatrical. It was procedural. The HOA did not announce defeat. It implied reconsideration. It did not admit overreach. It suggested reassessment. But the message was clear to anyone paying attention. The enforcement campaign had failed. The authority that fueled it had been tested and found wanting. The climax wasn't victory in the sense of celebration. It was vindication through exposure. The homeowner had not raised their voice, had not removed the flag, had not conceded ground. Instead, the HOA had been forced to confront the limits of its power, not internally, but under principles it could not bend. The very systems it relied on, documentation, procedure, governance, had become the instruments of its undoing. As the meeting adjourned, there was no resolution announced, no final ruling delivered. But the conflict had already reached its end. The HOA's posture had changed permanently. The certainty that once drove enforcement was gone, replaced by caution and calculation. The flag still flew, and in that quiet, unresolved ending lay the truth the HOA could not escape. This was no longer a matter they controlled. The story had moved beyond them, into consequences they could neither manage nor predict. What came next would not be decided in boardrooms or bylaws. It would unfold in the aftermath, where authority answers not to assumption, but to accountability. The aftermath didn't arrive with an apology or a formal announcement. It arrived the way power often retreats, quietly, cautiously, hoping not to draw attention to itself. In the days following the meeting, the HOA's tone changed completely. Where there had once been urgency, there was hesitation. Where there had been confidence, there was now restraint. Emails stopped arriving. Deadlines quietly expired without follow-up. The steady stream of notices that had once filled mailboxes and inboxes simply ceased, as though someone had turned off a machine that no longer knew how to operate safely. The first tangible sign came without explanation. The fines disappeared. No notice of reversal. No acknowledgement of error. Just an updated account statement showing a zero balance, as if the months of pressure had never existed. The line items were gone. The penalties erased. The record rewritten not through transparency, but through omission. It was the HOA's way of retreating without admitting it had advanced too far. Then the agenda changed. At subsequent meetings, the property was no longer mentioned. Not indirectly, not euphemistically. The issue that had once dominated discussion vanished completely. What had been framed as a threat to community standards was now treated as irrelevant, untouchable. Board members avoided eye contact when the topic came close. Conversations moved on quickly. Silence became policy. But consequences don't disappear just because attention does. Internally, the HOA fractured under the weight of its own overreach. The board members who had pushed hardest for enforcement suddenly found themselves isolated. Decisions they once defended confidently were now liabilities no one wanted to own. Committees were reshuffled, roles quietly reassigned. Legal counsel, once assertive, grew cautious and distant. Advice shifted from enforcement strategies to risk mitigation. Authority, once assumed, had become something that needed justification. The most telling change was procedural. New internal guidelines appeared, emphasizing caution, documentation review, and legal consultation before enforcement. What had once been instinctive, issue a notice, apply pressure, escalate, was now slowed by layers of review. Every action carried the ghost of what had happened, a reminder that unchecked authority leaves trails. The HOA still existed, but it no longer moved with the same confidence. Its reach shortened, its tone softened, its appetite for confrontation diminished. Power that relies on momentum does not recover easily from exposure. The community noticed. Neighbors who had once stayed quiet began asking questions, not about the flag, but about the HOA itself. Why the issue had escalated so aggressively. Why certain rules were enforced while others were ignored. Why a display that had existed peacefully for years suddenly became a crisis. The answers, when offered at all, felt thin and rehearsed. Trust eroded quietly. Meeting attendance dropped. Compliance became less automatic. Homeowners who had once followed directives without question began reading notices more carefully, challenging assumptions, asking for clarification. The HOA's authority hadn't just been limited legally, it had been weakened culturally. Once people see power fail, they stop treating it as inevitable. For the homeowner, the resolution wasn't a return to normal. It was a redefinition. The flag remained where it had always been, not as a statement of victory, but as proof that resistance hadn't been symbolic. It had been effective. What had once felt like a vulnerability had become clarity. The conflict revealed not just what could be challenged, but how. The experience changed the way ownership was understood. It was no longer just about maintaining property. It was about understanding boundaries, legal, procedural, and psychological. It became clear that large systems often rely on silence and fatigue more than legitimacy. They assume most people will comply simply to avoid discomfort. That assumption had been wrong. The documentation assembled during the dispute didn't get filed away and forgotten. It became a permanent archive, not out of paranoia, but preparedness. The lesson was simple and lasting. When authority pushes, it should be met with record, not reaction. Pressure thrives on emotion. It collapses under clarity. Emotion, too, changed shape. What began as frustration matured into resolve. The experience stripped away any illusion that fairness was automatic. It showed how quickly rules can be weaponized when context is ignored. How easily authority confuses order with control. But it also demonstrated how fragile that authority becomes when forced to justify itself beyond its own echo chamber. The involvement of outside scrutiny didn't just end the conflict, it reframed it. The HOA had believed it was operating privately, within a closed system where decisions rarely faced external evaluation. That belief dissolved the moment the issue crossed into principles larger than bylaws. Civil liberties do not bend to aesthetics. Rights do not dissolve under committee votes. The HOA learned that lesson not through punishment, but through proximity to consequences it could not manage. The long-term impact reached beyond one property. Other homeowners benefited indirectly. Enforcement across the community became more even, less aggressive, more deliberate. Selective pressure became harder to justify. The HOA, wary of repeating its mistake, hesitated before escalating issues that once would have triggered immediate action. Overreach, once exposed, becomes expensive to repeat. And the flag dispute became something else entirely, a reference point. Not spoken of openly, but remembered. A moment when authority misjudged its limits. When assumption collided with reality. When a homeowner refused to concede ground simply because pressure demanded it. The story spread quietly, reshaped by retelling, but always anchored in the same truth. The HOA had pushed too far, and it had paid the price in credibility. The resolution wasn't dramatic, but it was complete. No lawsuit needed to be filed. No settlement announced. No public apology issued. The outcome was decided through withdrawal, not concession. Through silence, not spectacle. The HOA stopped because it had to, not because it wanted to. That distinction mattered. Looking back, the conflict revealed something essential about power structures like HOAs. They are most confident when they believe no one will challenge them. They escalate not because they are strong, but because they are untested. When they finally encounter resistance grounded in law and persistence, their authority often proves thinner than expected. The lesson wasn't about flags or rooftops or even patriotism. It was about how easily systems mistake compliance for consent, how quickly they escalate when obedience is delayed, and how poorly they perform when forced to justify their actions outside their own frameworks. The homeowner didn't win by being louder, or more aggressive, or more defiant. They won by staying consistent, by letting the HOA document its own overreach, by refusing to collapse under pressure, by understanding that authority, when legitimate, doesn't need intimidation to function. And when it does rely on intimidation, it leaves evidence behind. The flag still flies, unchanged and unremarked upon now, blending back into the background of everyday life. The neighborhood looks the same. The houses stand where they always have. On the surface, nothing appears different. But something is. The HOA no longer assumes it is untouchable. The community no longer assumes it is always right. And one homeowner no longer assumes that silence is safer than resistance. In the end, nothing was taken from the HOA. It simply lost what it never truly had, the unquestioned right to decide how far its power extended. And that leaves behind a question that lingers far beyond this one dispute. In neighborhoods everywhere, authority operates by habit rather than justification. When rules are enforced without context, and power speaks louder than principle, do we comply out of convenience? Or do we ask who gave the right to speak at all?